March 21. I tell you that we probably had about 10 clients back then, right? And most of them were still like pilots.
It didn't seem like it.
And in the 5 years since, we've grown to work with close to 200 enterprises.
And if you're trying to create a model like Raven that's there to do a specific job, given it again, it's probabilistic, how do you make a call as to say, well, this is now done, the broth is ready?
We commit to you that we have our engine and that it's always going to be one of the best engines, right? Whether it's the best this year or it's second best, but it's up there. The performance division is working, and you can trust us that it's going to be at the very limits of what can be done with this technology.
Because that was the one thing I always loved about Poly, was that you always seem to have something a little bit different, which is very difficult to say in this space when everyone else is just building on top of OpenAI.
And anyone who thinks they'll just tune it up with a bit of data and then it works forever, they're flushing money down the drain.
All we seem to be doing is replacing what we've always done. So we're replacing the calls that we were always answering. We're replacing the chats that we were always having. This episode is with Nikola Mrkšić, who is the CEO of PolyAI. The last time I had Nikola on the podcast was in March 2021, right before, or in fact a year before, ChatGPT and large language models and the whole AI world blew up. This conversation is looking back essentially over the years and what's changed at PolyAI. PolyAI has been a company that has always been very deeply rooted in research. So it came out of Cambridge University, and unlike a lot of these other platforms that are built on top of all of the foundation models, PolyAI has maintained that research-led kind of approach, and in fact has its own, I wouldn't even call it fine-tuned, probably is fine-tuned, but incredibly deeply fine-tuned models trained on thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of customer conversations. It's called Raven, and this conversation is all about how you go about achieving incredibly high levels of accuracy when it comes to fine-tuned LLMs for conversations in contact centers. PolyAI has a voice pedigree, not exclusively these days, chat as well, omni-channel. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into this thing. We talk about the fine-tuning process. We talk about why you might do it in the first place. We also talk about how you can essentially completely remove hallucinations from language models by training the model on the guardrails at the model level rather than at the prompt level. And also we talk about the relationship between the model and the platform. Finally, we talk about some examples of businesses that are using PolyAI and the kind of results that they're seeing, as well as Gordon Ramsay. So Gordon Ramsay's restaurants are using the PolyAI platform, and they recently did a Super Bowl ad with Gordon Ramsay, and it is incredibly, incredibly funny. So we play that clip as well a little bit later on. Without further ado, this is Nikola Mrkšić from PolyAI on VUX World. All right, Nikola, welcome back after all this time.
Good to see you. How have you been?
Very well, thank you. Very well. How are you?
Excellent. It's a Friday, so
yeah, all good on a Friday. Definitely. Nice to see you again. We were saying just before we started there, the last time we did this officially on the VUX podcast was March 2021.
Ancient history.
It's crazy, isn't it? What's that, 5 year, 4 year, 5 year? And so a lot has happened since then, in the industry, in this space. So obviously let's start with, for those that didn't listen 5 years ago and who haven't come across PolyAI, maybe a little bit about PolyAI, and then we can get into what's changed, because you've been on a big journey over the last 5 years. It'd be interesting to understand
100%.
more about that.
I mean, look, I think what you say, March 21, I tell you that we probably had about 10 clients back then, right? And most of them were still like pilots.
It didn't seem like it.
Yeah.
It seemed like you were fairly, I at least the perception was that PolyAI, it's a fairly established, you were definitely in the mix there with like the Cognigies and the Boosts and all those kind of platforms at the time and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are companies that are still around, and they're definitely like cornerstones of the space. I think they were like the chat first omni-channel platforms, right? Whereas I think, our angle back then was like, hey, if you're really serious about voice and changing, our whole call to action was always like, let's change the way that people feel about automated voice. Let's make it really work, in a CSAT accretive way where, people speak to it and go like, wow, it's cool that I had that experience. Like, this company invested in me as a customer and I had a good experience, rather than, oh no, another way to deflect me and not give me what I need, right? So I think back then, we had just started some of our first larger enterprise engagements. And, in the 5 years since, we've grown to work with close to 200 enterprises, with a good number of them, not majority, but, I think like close to 10 of them are doing each the work of more than 1,000 full-time employees using our systems. And scaling that takes time, because it takes a company rewiring itself and its processes around this like workhorse that is modern AI, right? And I think that it couldn't have gotten to that scale, stage, and speed of adoption had the LLM moment not happened, right? We went from building very advanced and extremely fiddly things that required a lot of really good computer science to have that semblance of a fluid conversation, right? And I think, my team is interesting in that, whereas I think a lot of the others are CX experts or people from the contact center space, we were 3 researchers working on voice that kind of said like, hey, what can we do? What's our role to play in all this to get it to move to the next stage, right? And as we worked on it, it was really just like, can we deploy these voice systems, right? So voice was always at the center of it. And, deep learning was at its very core. We started our PhDs just as deep learning started taking off. So we were really at the right place at the right time to kind of like work through that adoption. And it's a story I never get tired of telling, but like I was at the OpenAI launch party and spoke with Ilya Sutskever, who literally, the way that the French are adamant that bread has what? Wheat, water, and salt. His whole thing was like bigger model, more data, and everything else, details that don't matter, right? And, I think we were adding just enough structure into those models to actually make them work back then, right? And it was really funny because the moment that, from GPT-3 onwards, when it became clear that the emergent properties are getting us something that we didn't bake in deliberately, but really it emerges just from training on, insane amounts of data. It was like, he was right all along. He told us what he's going to do, went at it, worked for many years, and happened, right? So the moment that happened, we were like, belief state updated, the world is now this, and we were ready. And a lot of what we had built on the speech side, on the text-to-speech side as well, was kind of like waiting for that moment to happen. So I remember we had a few large deals in flight that we managed to convert to what you would now think of as agentic systems, right? Things that operate with an LLM at its core with vastly better capabilities that continue to improve as the LLM gets better as well, right? So we got PG&E to agree to run a fully LLM-powered system. And I'm so thankful they did, because I swear to God, if it happened 6 months later, then the panic already kicked in. And all the regulated industries started having, like model councils and, the AI Act and everything else around it and the different state laws in America would have made it quite difficult. But because we had the first large-scale LLM-powered voice agent, it became one that was easy to point to others and say, well, look, if one of the largest utility companies in the world can run it, why should you be so afraid?
And what year was that? What year was that when they deployed that?
It went live in February 24.
Okay, that's interesting. And I always thought that PolyAI. So for those that don't know, you guys come out of Cambridge University, wasn't it? You were researchers, and you stumbled across something that you then productized. Very similar to kind of in terms of that journey, very similar to Action AI. I don't know if you remember Action AI. A company that they were doing some interesting stuff, to be fair. I don't think they managed to be able to scale what they were doing. It took a lot of time and effort to build in their technology and stuff like that. So I think that kind of hampered them in the end. But for me, and you can tell me if this is correct or not, but I remember at the end of 2021, just after our conversation, I was having conversations with like Jason Mars from Zero Shot Bot. We were talking to Vlooper and a bunch of these companies. And the term kept coming up, which was transformers. Kept coming up throughout the back end of 2021. Oh, transformer models are going to change everything, and there's NLU's dead and all this kind of stuff. And I was thinking, okay, yeah, fair enough. And I did a lot of podcasts about it. A year later, ChatGPT comes out. The whole world goes LLM crazy. And I remember looking back probably a couple of years ago now, when I was thinking about PolyAI and companies like that come out of the universities, and I always wondered, was some of the secret sauce that you had then using and leveraging what was then known as transformer models like GPT-2 and those earlier versions before it ever kicked off? Was that part of your kind of secret sauce back then or not?
Absolutely. So our convert model, which was a very complex three ranker. So basically it could choose what to say out of, I think tens of thousands of things that it could say. So you know how an LLM works by predicting the next word and then the next word and then the next word. This was just at a slightly more granular level above, in that it was choosing the next sentence, right, out of many, many candidates. But I think, it stood with, what did convert stand for? It's been so long that I forget what the full title of the paper was, but it was efficient and accurate conversational representations from transformers. So RT convert, right? So if they were transformer-based models, they just weren't language models. They were selection models that picked out of just a number of candidate sentences embedded in a vector space, right? So transformers were revolutionary in that there were a few of these waves of kind of technology advancing in deep learning that just made it 10 times easier to do something. They made it work every time so that you could then build the next thing, right? When I started my PhD, for instance, you had to, the main platform used was called Tiano. This predates PyTorch and TensorFlow that later kind of took over. But, you had to, Tiano was revolutionary because you didn't have to compute mathematically the derivative of your neural network, right? So that saved you 90% of the work. But then the fiddly thing during our PhDs, and it was really deep learning all the way up to kind of the transformer era, the optimization function, kind of getting the whole thing to settle. It was like boiling a goulash and waiting and hoping that the ratio of, meat, salt, and maybe wine you added is just right. And there was really very little science to it. It was all as people say today, vibes, right? It was a feeling of hey, what can it? How do you get it? It was a matter of taste and intuition, right? And even today, when you look at tuning an LLM, it is a dark art, right? It's how long do you do supervised fine tuning? When do you switch to this preference optimization? How do you encode the different reward functions? When do you do these different parts of training one after another so that the whole thing settles into a nice broth? Right. So it's funny that really that continued evolution of the intuition makes deep learning experts. This is the reason why companies pay so much money for them and why they're in such high demand, because, you get to develop that intuition further by burning tens of millions every year running those things, right? So it's kind of you and I don't get to be Formula One drivers. Hell, we probably wouldn't be incredible, but maybe it would be okay. But no one's gonna give us the car and a crew and a team to check just how mediocre and what level of mediocre we'd be, right? And who knows how many people out there could have been Lewis Hamilton, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Interesting. So I think that's part of the challenge, not just on the model training, but even in the deployment of these applications. Maybe we'll get to the deployment later, but in terms of I know you've got kind of Raven 3.5 that was released recently, which we can talk about. And I think that part of what I think at least is going to become a very hot topic, if it's not already, at least for businesses, it is the whole concept of fine tuning. Because the big, large models, they're good for some things, but actually they're only going to get so far. And everything that we've kind of seen and come across in terms of, leveraging large language models for various elements of enterprise automation, you can see that there could be value in fine-tuning certain aspects of it. But the thing is in the same way as I think some businesses are struggling to understand when is my agent ready to go live, because it's not like a traditional machine learning system where you can look at the probability and the predictions and you can say, right, typically speaking, it's predicting X amount of times and therefore we're happy. It's very much kind of as you said, it's a more of an intuitive feeling or what have you. But then, so that's at the deployment stage, but then roll it back a little bit. And if you're trying to create a model like Raven that's there to do a specific job, given it, again, it's probabilistic, how do you make a call as to say, well, this is now done, the broth is ready?
It is hard, right? And I do not envy the modern large enterprise CIO one bit. It's up there with the CFO on the list of jobs I would not want to do, right? Because, they're managing large, complex organizations. It's hard to get them to move. And then when you get them to move, you hope you got them to move in the right direction. And if you didn't, my God, it can be an expensive mistake, right? So part of what is built into the fabric of PolyAI, and something that I think is an important aspect of us as a company, is that we commit to being at that forefront. And every company will say that declaratively, but I think for us, it just comes from who we are, in that we have no choice but to stay at the forefront because that is who we are, right? We are researchers in the space. So Raven and the whole effort to really have our own LLM, not a cutesy fine-tuned LLM, but really, I joke with our team and have delusional all hands, but this badge, to me, think of it as a BMW of this space. We commit to you that we have our engine and that it's always going to be one of the best engines, right? Whether it's the best this year or it's second best, but it's up there. The performance division is working, and you can trust us that it's going to be at the very limits of what can be done with this technology, because that's why we started the company, right? How you then package it up and how you go from an M car that is like a racing car to luxurious yet fun to drive thing. That's what, to me, is the scaling of our platform and product is, right? Which is, how do we give those companies a way to, drive it safely and yet have a bit of fun when they want to and when the road conditions allow, right? And I think that knowing when the model is ready is really hard. I think that doing it at model level alone is something that no one has really cracked fully, right? I think that the way we train, tune, and build our models, the way we have kind of deployed before, including with some of those models that were in LLM based previously, and hence were safer. So those conversations were guardrailed in a much more in a much stricter and reliable way. When we tune Raven with that data, we're teaching it what's right in a setting that is like customer service over the phone or over chat, right? And because of that, it has a very strong intuition built over many layers of deployments over many years of what good looks like, right? And it just reinforces it during that fine-tuning stage where it's just not going to go overly creative on you, right? And you get the broth you aimed for, right? So with OpenAI, it is primarily focused on getting you to engage with a consumer app. That's why it always, almost sociopathically agrees with you, and why it always asks you questions at the end. It just wants to keep the conversation going, right? That's not what you need to do in customer service. You need to be friendly, forthcoming, maybe proactive, but not pushy. And you need to be very empathetic. And, you can't take the conversation in any direction. You have a set of goals in front of you. So that comes with Raven, right? And I think that level of just doing 90% of the guardrailing work at model level is really important, because it just makes the remaining part easier. Because then you look at and you just say, where can I absolutely not afford for anything to go wrong, right? Let's say I'm in a banking scenario. If I'm making a payment from Nikola's account, I better be sure that it is Nikola that I'm speaking with and that he wants to transfer money to Kane Sims, right? And then you implement, part of the flow in a programmatic way where you make it code-based. You create a programmatic check and rules that can be as strict as you want them to be, as strict as any rule-based system, to say, I will only ever initiate it if I've collected these pieces of information, if this other piece of code ran and flipped these 3 Boolean parameters. And then, there isn't really a question of, will the model hallucinate? It is just physically impossible for it to do the key select things that you want to keep, behind a firewall, which is subject to, no machine learning powered decision. Other than that, it can always go wrong. Any machine learning powered, including pre-LLM, conversation could go wrong. I remember my favorite example of intent-based systems going sideways was some of our first deployments were with restaurants, and one of our lead researchers called the system, and he was Polish. He was like, "Can I bring my Polish friends?" And the system went like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, but you can't bring your own alcohol." And I was like, wow, that's like, and back then, as today, we look at these systems and the biases they pick up from data, and, hey, Poles love drinking, right? And then just to, push the system to its limits, we tried every nation under the sun. I was quite amused by, can I bring my Serbian friend group? And they were like, kids are allowed. I was like, well, I think we are a bit of a childish nation, right? So that was a funny instance where even intent-based models would kind of like have some form of pre-training, do something that you didn't intend, right? So similarly, these systems can still say something that in a particular situation may not be the best thing to say, but you can make sure that they do nothing catastrophic, right? And I think if you're working as a wrapper company on top of an OpenAI or anyone else, you have a lot less control. It doesn't mean your systems will do something terrible, but hey, we've seen Gap with a racist chatbot, right? And that's because someone didn't have a model that knows that it shouldn't have racial abuse built into the model, right? So, I think it's an open problem, but I think there are those two levels. One is have a model that doesn't get you in trouble most of the time, and then have programmatic, rigid control that stops the really bad things from happening, right?
So the first, I'd definitely like to unpack that a bit. You mentioned, I think at the beginning of this, you said that it's not a cutesy fine-tuned model, which I like the term. So what would a cutesy fine-tuned model be, and what's the difference between that and Raven?
Well, I think in practice, it really boils down to like how much data you're using and how you're using that data, right? Because if you're just doing supervised fine-tuning, that's basically where you kind of continue training the model just with like, hey, next word is this, next word is this, here's some examples. Like, you will impact its style, and that's about it, right? Whereas if you're doing things like DPO, right, direct preference optimization, that's where you kind of start building these harnesses where one LLM acts as a judge and kind of like works with the other LLM of like, hey, saying this is better than this, right? And then you take hugely powerful reasoning models, right? Think like Opus 4.6 or whichever the most latest reasoning model is from any of the larger guys, right? The foundational labs. And then because you're training, it's not real-time voice, which has to be fast. You kind of pause time and you go like, all right, let's use everything at our disposal to think hard about what we would do in this situation. It's like a basketball or whatever football team watching a replay, and like you pause here and you're like, see, you should have passed here. You had a gap. Oh, right. Like, so next time look, I have to look right. If you can do that, pass to Kane, right? And in doing that, you're kind of teaching it how to do better reasoning on the fly, right? To develop that intuition so that in a live situation, it knows to recognize that situation, right? And doing that, I'm only scratching the surface. And frankly, I've been long gone towards, building, scaling a company, selling software, looking at large implementations, traveling every other day. But my research team is in this daily, right? And it's also like looking at basically how big that team is, who is in that team. And frankly, it's very hard for companies in this space, no matter how well funded we are, to have a large team of people that are good enough, because these guys make easy 7 figures at a Google, OpenAI, etc. And I think that's where we just have an unnatural advantage in that we come from that group of people. We are that group of people. We love working with each other. We love that we probably have the closest, the loop between like building a foundational model and applying it in the real world in the way that we want and can. Like, it's pretty powerful that we have that and the ability to then tomorrow have that model tested with like 200 enterprise clients. And, we build that into our contracting. We've built the permissions around using data in the right way, still safe, enterprise anonymized, but still conducive to tuning that model, right? And that's why I built PolyAI, because I wanted to be in control of our own fate as we build better and better and bigger conversational systems. You need data, you need money, you need people. You need to be able to choose exactly what you're going to work on. So, it's all going according to plan.
Nice. So what would, for example, let's say that a business wants to get kind of better performance out of their generative AI systems, out of their AI agents, and they have, a whole bunch of recordings of really great conversations. They redact all the personal information, all that kind of stuff, and they fine tune, let's say, Llama on that data. So they've got a big, file, a JSON file or what have you. It's just full of transcripts labeled saying this is a good one. If someone says this, say something like that. And they've got this kind of, piece of training data. Let's say, I don't know, 100, 500,000 good conversations. They fine tune this model. What would that get them, and what does Raven have over and above that would have it perform better in conversation?
Scale and the know-how how to do it, right? I mean, like one client individually doesn't add all that much, because there are two parts of this, right? One is what the base model can do, and think of that as just like the raw horsepower of a car, right? And then there's like how it comes together into the vehicle that, it could be a Tesla Model 3. It's really fast, but it is no Porsche, right? It doesn't have the aerodynamics, the weight tuning, everything else that makes one substantially more interesting to drive and more interesting to handle than the other, right? Even though the other could be faster. What it really means in practice is that if they tune Llama with that model, they won't really make much of an impact unless they overfit to the point where they've just reproduced something that basically parrots what they've seen in their conversations historically. I think that's been one of the kind of like more insidious, tales told by a lot of vendors. Like, we'll just inject your data and your bot is ready. That's not true. That's not what businesses want either, by the way. They want to see a system that clearly and accurately captures their business logic, so that they know that it did capture the business logic, so that at the end of the day, if something changes, they can go and change that one thing towards the new rule. Because if you have all of your historic conversations, well, it's a dynamic time period. The rules changed. What you say as a retailer during the Christmas period when you can't meet every demand versus a normal week in April is different, right? So if a model is just looking at that data, it's not aware of the surrounding business context of, the rule, the circumstance is different. The contact center was getting hammered at that point, so we were saying no to it, to, handling this kind of call with a human at that point, and we were having people leave voicemails versus another time we just went through that 12-minute call about a refund, right? Or, we issued a refund here. We offered someone 6 months for free for them not to cancel their internet contract. And then 3 months later, we offered something else. Which one is right? So you can't just learn that from data. You need to go back and look at, hey, where did that human that said that in the conversation, what were they looking at? What were the rules, right? So really it's about how you're going to structure the system around it. And that's where it goes above the model layer into the platform layer. And you can't really separate the two, right? One kind of engine goes into a Tesla and another kind goes into a Porsche, right? And they share a lot, but they're not the same thing, right? So if you just plug, a Tesla engine in a different car, it may work, but it's probably going to be a bit of a zombie, right? And that it's not really fit for purpose. So when that business does that kind of fine tuning, honestly, they've just done a science experiment that they probably shouldn't have done, because this is expensive. They don't know how to do it. As I said, it kind of takes a lot of runs of this to get it right, to learn whether it makes an impact. And, it's the equivalent to me trying to reshape my car for better aerodynamics so it goes a bit faster. I don't know why I'm on this car street now, but, I can't do much. Maybe I can do something to get it 0 to 60 to be a bit faster. But, maybe I can just throw out, the back seats to reduce the weight. Like, that's the equivalent of what most companies doing this can do themselves. And I don't say that because I think we're great because we can do it. It's just that it's one of the few things that we do. And we do it with hundreds of customers. We get their different data. So that engine is as good as it can be. So that when it is implemented with our platform, you get something really good in the end. But it really is a matter of like taking historic conversations, and you can use them to get a really good draft of what that system in that platform is likely supposed to look like. But then the advantage moves on to a different plane. And, we're preparing big releases that are coding tool related, but it turns out that those platforms that were less advanced in the whole like point and click, drag and drop world, and no matter how much we tried, we never became that company because it's really hard to marry complexity, both in terms of doing voice and really complex use cases, with simplicity in UI and UX, right? So I mean, it is true that we, for years, had failed to make it simple. And I don't think anyone's built both the really powerful point and click thing while also making it work in low code settings where it can do really complex things. Now, for us, being in that low code, well, high code even, mode for a lot of these large deployments, now means that when you use our ADK, Agent Development Kit, and initially it was used by our internal teams, and then it was pushed out aggressively to those that are more tech forward among our clients, then as our models implement their systems, looking at their data, they're also looking at everything that we have ever done as a company. Like, if I'm collecting a British postcode, this module needs to look like this because British postcodes are really, really hard. And, a P and a B sound the same, and an N and an M sound the same. So, I should follow up with, hey, that second thing, was that a Mike or a November? And, you don't say that in a normal conversation, but we find ourselves saying that a lot when we're collecting postcodes because it's the only way to make it work with like 95% success rates. So that all put together is a way in which those teams that want to build can use the new platforms, new coding tools, and our platform to build things themselves. But it's not so much a matter of they take their data and they get it. I wish it was that simple. It's really them figuring out what will work for them. Because that ninja coder doing this, that's still a very advanced user. That's no hobbyist, right? And then that person, together with our teams, has to translate the, kind of like the knobs and the wheels on that thing for the contact center so that they can use it practically, knowing clearly what each kind of like button does so that they can operate the machine. And, I think we've made huge strides in customers doing that themselves. I think that the future contact center is starting to resemble kind of like an air traffic control tower where, you have these like ninjas that are working with our teams to like translate the business logic into something usable. And then you have increasingly more sophisticated business users who are finally able to do impressive things with AI. But that translation of the bit has to go through the platform layer, not just the model layer. And anyone who thinks they'll just tune it up with a bit of data and then it works forever, they're flushing money down the drain.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So when you say that the model and the platform have to work together, what would an example of that be? So you've got Raven, highly tuned on, all kinds of conversational data from years gone by. So it's got a lot of variety and a lot of dynamism in terms of how it can handle input and output in terms of language. But then you need to make it work for a business who, has to collect a postcode, but this system that they use to log the postcode is a bit different and it's a homegrown API and it's a bit clunky. So, and then their business logic states that they've got to do X, Y, Z with the postcode. You know what I'm saying? So every business, even though they might do the same thing on the surface, they have different business logic, different APIs, different systems. Could you explain a little bit about the relationship between the model and the platform when it comes to actually then deploying that for a business?
Absolutely. I mean, that's where it gets really fun, right? And really difficult. All of these deployments that we got scaled and like where they were actually doing the work of a few hundred and in a few cases, even thousands of people came, on the back of a lot of work by our teams and client teams on those integrations, on kind of like setting up basically a plan and like a code book of how the system should behave in these large stakes conversations. It doesn't happen overnight, right? They have to figure out like what they have, how it can be used, whether they trust it or not. Then it goes live and you find a few edge cases. And, some edge cases are the system not working and we're on the hook to figure that out. But in other cases, it's like, hey, inevitably in a large deployment, you hear like, and 20% of the calls are failing because the API times out or, like doesn't accept this format, returns codes that they don't know about, right? And then the archaeological quest starts. So like, well, like who knows what that code means, right? And then like that is part of their digital transformation. And I think the really cool thing now is that with computer use improving, we can skip a lot of that because this was expensive and difficult. And it made us so focused on strategic enterprises. Companies would think like 5,000, 10,000 plus agents. Those are big companies. There aren't that many of them, right? And the problem is hugely valuable for them. But there are many others with a few hundred, few thousand where, the line between where the investment made sense was a bit like more murky, right? Now with computer use, you can often just have an AI do exactly what a human would have done, right? Use the different systems, look at all the sources of tribal knowledge, and you know what a contact center looks like. I think that for a lot of vendors coming in and pretending it's easy, they've not really seen what the average agent goes through, right? Like with their like 2 screens and like a tier 2 agent around to help them and, getting like waved down by 3 people at once to help them with this or help them with that. While looking at 4 different files to figure out where it might be and asking people in chat at the same time while trying to buy time on the phone to produce an answer. So, all of that is really difficult. And I think that, if we can get these things to safely operate the way that a human agent would on that screen, well, that just like puts the cost of that integration to zero, right? Now, it may not be the optimal way to do it, and you get a lot of value out of translating it into an API layer where like the decision is clearly made and understood for this is to be done in this way. But, it's trade-offs. And I think that for the most part, if you can get it going quickly now with computer use, you should. And like we find ourselves more and more really enabling our forward deployed engineers to almost build these emulators, things that create families of APIs that don't exist on the client side. We build it ourselves and we go, does this look right? No? And then they go, no, that's wrong. Okay, cool. We dig in, figure that out. And then in the end, we basically built like a converter from, like a British plug to an American plug. And it's like, we have it, right? And, the cost of doing this is decreasing as the tools improve. To the point where we're now often just going into first encounter with an enterprise with half of their systems mapped out from what we're able to see from the outside. And that's really what it takes because, if you can become a CIO's ally in not introducing another transformation project that's needed for them to realize ROI on that conversational system, you're going to be their friend.
Yeah. How do you tackle the latency question around computer use then? Because I've always kind of thought that computer use is a nice idea. Certainly from a B2C perspective, I can see it being a very nice idea and it can be very helpful because a lot of systems, an end user, the average Joe hasn't got a first clue about APIs. But my kind of perspective was always that a business should really just build the APIs. So I don't know what your thoughts are around that in terms of like where computer use adds value and how you deal with the latency question.
You're spot on, right? I mean, no matter how much better they've gotten, and they have, I think that systems doing computer use are blowing old RPA out of the water now, but they're still very slow, right? And, you can't really trust it for real time. But what you can do is use computer use systems to build a proxy for an API, right? Because half of the things happening as you click through a browser and whatever are HTTPS calls. So if you can build a model that learns how to do that really quickly, that model at runtime is no longer reasoning and looking at the whole screen, parsing pixels, looking at where to click, to put in a different URL. Like it just learns, okay, next thing, HTTPS call that needs to have this thing replaced with that like key that I get from here. So then basically it's rebuilding the API, right? But it can't always be done, right? It is sometimes not possible, but often you can kind of like through the repetition of computer use, build what is effectively, like a programmatic way rather than a computer vision in the loop, clicking a mouse, etc. It might have learned to go like, stop now move mouse there, right? And it still has like a part to learn around like the screen looks like this, and if it doesn't, it'll return an error, and then you're going to figure out what different environments it operates in and how to handle that. But we looked at buying a contact center in 2019, right? And back then, when I looked at like UiPath and those systems, hugely exciting, but the cost of doing that in order to mock up an API was just impossible, right? I was building some of those things myself, and we were a much smaller company back then, and I was like, fascinating, but now is not the time. We're approaching an era now where it is the time. And with that, I think that just the barriers to doing way more collapse, right? Because, you could always build, and there were times that we unlocked early on large enterprise deployments by effectively giving ourselves permission and making assumptions over the client's tech stack to build the API ourselves. Because if you're waiting for, budget from someone, and then someone has to put it in a plan, and their IT moves slowly, and it'll be put in the budget, approved for next year, so the work can start in 8 months. Hey, who's got time for that, right? And I mean, look, it's happened for us in our large deals. Something happens, budget is approved, and 3 years later, the contract magically becomes 5 times larger because now we can do everything, right? It's not vanilla computer use and like kumbaya, an AI system is in, and you wouldn't want it to be in at all times as well, because, well, God knows what it could do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So how does that translate then to the results? You mentioned, was it PG&E you mentioned, doing the work of 1,000 agents and, scale? How does all of this stuff we've been talking about so far translate to the client and their customers? Could you give us some examples maybe of some of the use cases and some of the achievements that you've kind of...
Absolutely, right. I mean, I think we're very much focused on the real world economy, right? And the real problem, not just, think like startups and the classic Silicon Valley playbook. We're vastly American in revenue now. But even in America, our largest states are like, well, California is largest just because it's the biggest, but there's a lot of Texas, Florida, the Midwest. Nevada is huge. We're huge in Vegas, right? That was like our big breakthrough. And it was great for our brand, because if Caesars will trust you with this, well, they don't treat their brand lightly. They want you to have a good experience. So, the moment we got to the point that every other casino on the strip works with us, you kind of knew that like this is a brand, and it was really good for our brand. But with larger enterprises, think PG&E, I think we've had days where we approached like 1 million calls, right? And that's just insane. Like outages happen, and it holds, and that builds a reputation around like it cannot break, right? It will take every call, and you're already having a terrible time. You have a power outage, but at least you call and they tell you when it's going to be back. Right, and they text you with a tracker, and they text you when it's back, right? And maybe you're worrying about your freezer at home, and now it's back. That's great, right? And then equally, another really good example is a company called Safe Ride Health. That case study is coming soon. But when we started working with them, they were already like a scale up. But in the time that we worked with them, I think they grew 13 times, right? Wow. And we handle about 80 to 90% of their calls, successfully containing around 70%, right? And they do non-urgent medical transport. So if someone's going for a physiotherapy after, a hip replacement, or they are doing dialysis because their kidneys are failing and they do daily trips, these guys handle that transport, right? We've built a system that gets better CSAT than humans for the things that it can do, which is most things. And that allowed them to be more competitive in pricing to any of their competitors, right? So they've won so much of this market. And I think that we now handle probably close to 1/5 of all medical transport calls in America.
Wow.
Right. And, with them, we work with the likes of United Healthcare, Aetna, Kaiser Permanente, and 30 other health plans that I can't name off the top of my head. And that's, I think, a really good way for a startup like us to get that exposure to the real world economy by partnering with someone who knows how to crack that industry, right? Equally, we've got partners that are kind of like ISVs in the hospitality space that have rolled out hundreds of Marriotts around the world, right? By, kind of like white labeling our platform and then building additional IP on top of it, right? So that I think is a really good way to scale. But then, we love our good old, traditional large forward deployed things. So think anything from, a FedEx to PG&E to Allstate or NatWest or UniCredit, right? So there are big European successes. I think with UniCredit, we have the first European Central Bank approved deployment of, again, an LLM-powered agentic system for what we think of as kind of like the full gamut of use cases, from like authenticating, making a payment, talking about fraudulent transactions. So the scale of all of those things is serious, and in many of them, it's highly multilingual. Probably, I think 50% of our revenue, if not 60%, is in highly regulated industries. So banking, insurance, healthcare, utilities. Healthcare is huge, right? I think healthcare went from 1 to over 10 million in revenue in 1 year.
Wow.
And we weren't a healthcare focused company. By now it's grown so much that it's number one among all our verticals. And the appetite is there. And it's mostly in the US, although we got our first NHS trust recently. So, making waves here as well.
Nice. That is wicked. And one of the things that I've always been a fan of with Poly is that, you mentioned that Vegas was good for the brand, and you've done a few things in Vegas in terms of branding and billboards and taxi ads and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things more recently, which I've got lined up here actually, is the advert that you did with Gordon Ramsay. So I'm going to play this ad. Hopefully you can hear it. Everyone else that's tuning in can hear it and watch it. We'll listen to this ad, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about the work that you've done with Gordon Ramsay's restaurants.
Yeah. Chateau Eagle. Let's see what all the fuss is about, shall we?
Welcome to Chateau Eagle. To make a reservation, say reservation.
Reservation.
To ask for a menu.
Please, seriously?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. To make a reservation, say reservation.
Madame, s'il vous plaît, reservation.
Sorry, please hold for
donut.
17 minutes.
Gordon, what can I do for you?
I would love a table for tonight.
At your new restaurant?
Yes. How did you know? My diary
has an opening at 7, right after your guided meditation session.
That's perfect. Could also get a
bottle of the Malbec.
Yes.
It'll be breathing when you sit down. You're good to go, Gordon.
Finally, someone who listens.
Did you hear that or not?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so that was really good. So that was released kind of in line with the Super Bowl, yeah? Can you tell us a little bit about how that come about and how the work that you're doing with Gordon Ramsay transpires?
Yeah, well, look, Gordon's been a client of ours for about 2 years now, his restaurants. And again, that's we love brands that are top brands, right? Because if they are willing to put you on the phone, it means that you're doing something really good for their business. And I don't know of a man who is more particular about what good service looks like than Gordon Ramsay, right? We also really I personally am a huge fan. I find, Hell's Kitchen therapeutic, and, I share sentiments about a lot of things. And much like Poly, although you couldn't tell from my accent, but we're a British company that has made it globally, and that is huge in America, kind of like how Gordon is as well, right? So we thought that he was a really, a good spirit animal for PolyAI, right? And, we are known for uncompromising levels of service. We're known for our taste around what a good system looks like, and our ownership of those outcomes for our clients. So, when he agreed to be our brand ambassador, we had a lot of fun recording that. And it got incredible reception, I think, during the Super Bowl, and kind of with people sharing it onwards. And if my metrics are right, I think it got more eyes than the Anthropic and OpenAI ads put together, which as a smaller startup, you kind of have to fight for those moments.
Absolutely. And the Anthropic ones did the rounds as well,
They were great.
Yeah, they were really good, yeah. And
They're really good.
And that's a big achievement to do better than them. But yeah, no, listen, Nikola, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you again. Really, really, I mean, I knew that PolyAI was doing well. Obviously, you recently raised Series D and stuff like that, and you've come a long way since we spoke in 2021. But I think just hearing the brands that you're working with, the accomplishments that you have, and particularly glad to sort of see that the pedigree of focusing on making this technology work at the bleeding edge is still really central to what you do. Because that was the one thing I always loved about Poly, was that you always seem to have something a little bit different, which is very difficult to say in this space when everyone else is just building on top of OpenAI. And so it's really great to see that that's kind of continued.
100%, man. And look, I think that I've done my rounds of early stage sales and all of that, and I'm still very involved with many of our customers. But I hired a phenomenal president of go-to-market, a guy called Ryan Longfield. He led Gong through their growth era, and is a real kind of force and a really well-known guy in the space. It's given me a lot more time back to be in the center of the company, right? Still the key, to pass the signal from customers and stuff, but focus less on growing just the go-to-market engine and more to go back to that performance division and say, what do we need for the next 5 years of this, right? And the things that I'm really excited about now actually transcend voice quite a bit. I mean, voice will always be a key pillar of our performance division, but I think in the future, you will see companies completely reimagine what their contact us page looks like into a true omni-channel experience. And as we went more omni-channel and started doing different forms of chat, co-browsing experiences, putting phone calls on websites, stuff like that, it's starting to, there's this Cambrian explosion of the things, of the kinds of things that people are trying. It's going to look very different in a few years. It will be hyper personalized. You might be on the website, and by the cookie we'll know that it's you, and that you're frustrated with your returns. You'll click that phone and be like, okay, did that not work either? We're really sorry. We'll give you a refund. Now, if that happened, you'd be like, okay, maybe you messed up my order, but wow, right? You'd be like, these guys are 10 notches above their competitors. So that's what we're trying to do with a lot of our clients. And I'm really happy that we didn't just wash out into hit board plan, do this, do that. Of course we do that. But more importantly, I've never had more fun at work than in the past 6 months, because the technology is accelerating to the point where, and I've got small kids. There was a moment where I was damn, what is the world going to look like? Which I think always happens in these industrial revolution moments where we find it hard to imagine. And it must have been terrifying, as steam engine and cars came in, 90% of us were agricultural workers 150 years ago, right? And I think we like our lives more like this. And I think the current agricultural workers with their mechanization are having a blast. It's actually a really fun job, right? So I think everything's going to be awesome in terms of I'm not saying that it's going to be an era of abundance where we're all just playing computer games day and night, but I think we're going to have better lives. And I think for all of us tech companies, we get to build more, right? And I think as you see the mundane software engineering go away, you see these creative individuals empowered to do more, just build way more things, right? And, you see Elon non-ironically talking about putting, data centers in space because it makes more sense. And, as crazy as he is, he's probably going to pull it off, right? So then, when you think of the future in those parameters, you're like, wow, I can't wait to see what happens in a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really exciting for me at the minute is that, aside from the development in terms of experiences that can be provided to the end user, and what you were saying there in terms of the contact pages, I think it's going to go beyond the contact pages, and websites and apps and all of that stuff is just going to become a liquid soup of different types of interfaces with AI at the center of it all. But I think that part of my concern has been over the last couple of years that all we seem to be doing is replacing what we've always done. So we're replacing the calls that we were always answering. We're replacing the chats that we were always having, the emails we were always receiving. And it's that's great because the experience is better. It frees up the business, and there's 100% value in that. And I think there's a hell of a long way to go on that journey before all of that is a solved problem. But I think that what's interesting is what AI allows you to do. You know, you talked about the AI in software engineering. I mean, it's not even software engineering now. It's like AI is now available to anyone. I might have to reconsider what I was doing after this conversation, but I've been recently fine-tuning a model to get it to write like me so that I can expedite a first draft. But I would never have been able to do something like that. I can't code. I haven't got a first clue what I'm doing. If it wasn't for Claude Code being able to speak my language, I wouldn't have got anywhere near it. So I think the value is also in the ability for this technology to give us the space to do things that we previously couldn't even imagine.
100%. Imagination is the only limiting factor now, right? You always knew that could, in theory, be done. And now you're like, well, why not? And then you do it. And you're sitting there at 4 a.m. and it's partially working and it's not. And you're like, wow, right? And then it's your own work. So then it's precious to you and it's wonderful. And you shouldn't reconsider what you're doing because you're doing something that is like according to your specs and you need it. And you're having fun. And isn't that like such a joy, right? Yeah. So I think people worrying about, is software engineering going to be automated? No. Kane Sims is now a frontier machine learning applied researcher. And that's awesome, right? Because, God knows what you'll build. Because now you're contributing your imagination to the collective effort. And man, you never lacked imagination, right? So, in many ways, guys like you have a lot more to give than guys like me who might have sat in a lab obsessing over an accuracy and the cost function of a model. You are out there thinking, and all of us together. So you're right. I don't think that's the Contact Us page. That's just the start. I think really it'll be an orchestrator of a whole new relation with technology, and the form factor has not yet emerged.
Yeah.
Right. It's completely unclear. The phone is great, right? It's a great GUI, but it hasn't really changed in a long time. We're still not really speaking to our smart speakers in a way that Jeff Bezos imagined when he poured billions into Alexa. AR is not there yet in a way that we all have. So Neuralink is not yet there. So it's all kind of at the edge. There needs to be a breakthrough, I think, in the interface layer before the new world comes into being. But everything we do as we transform that old world is part of preparing for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, absolutely fantastic conversation, Nikola. I really appreciate that. Is it poly.ai, the website? Yeah. Poly.ai. Yeah. Definitely recommend you go and check that out. We'll put the links in the show notes below and links to everything. Gordon Ramsay face on the front page. I like that. Yeah. Wicked. All right. Thank you, Nikola. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you again on the next one. Thanks now. Bye.
Thank you for having me, Ken.
You're very welcome. Very welcome.